Hello and welcome to our YouTube channel, RV Tips from Jan. Today's topic, there was a brawl at the campground and my grandchildren had to see all of those shenanigans. There's a great video on YouTube by Alan Warren, the RV Wingman. Alan has a channel, Be a Better Camper, and his videos about that particular subject really hit home with me. And I want to thank Alan Warren, the RV Wingman, for putting out those videos, because there's no question with the increased numbers of RVs that have been sold, the increased numbers of new RVers that we have at the various campgrounds, we are seeing an increase in bad behavior. And 2 weeks ago, when my wife and myself and other family members were at a campground for a week, we saw that firsthand. Across the street from us, there was a brawl. It involved what appeared to be an ex-husband with his ex-wife and her current either boyfriend or husband. They had grandma and grandpa there at the campsite, and they had the grandkids there at the campsite. And it came to fisticuffs, to the point where the campground rangers were called. They eventually got the local authorities, the sheriff, involved. And after quite a bit of discussion and investigation, they escorted the gentleman who initiated the fight, who I would say was in his 30s, shirtless, appeared to be intoxicated, off the campgrounds. And they actually got him a ride so that he didn't have to drive his vehicle as he left. Unfortunately, they probably should have arrested the gentleman, because about 3 hours later, he got a taxi and came back, and this was after dusk, so the campground was dark. And sure enough, we're sitting around a campfire with our entire family, our grown kids, our grandkids, my wife and myself, and the next thing we know, there's screaming and hollering, and somebody says he's got a gun, and all of the shenanigans that had happened 2.5 hours earlier were repeated right in front of us. The guy who was responsible took off running through the campground. Fortunately, the authorities captured him, arrested him, and off to the pokey he went. But it really ruined our evening, and I felt bad that the kids at that campsite were all subject to that kind of behavior. And what was really regretful is that our grandchildren, we had 9 of them there, had to witness that behavior. It really put a damper on that particular day. So I'm making this video to talk about bad behavior at the campground and what I think we need to be doing collectively to address this. And frankly, it starts with the campground authorities. Are they following their own rules? In this case, they were not. One of the rules for this particular campground is a limit of 2 vehicles per campsite. There were more than 2 vehicles at that particular campsite. And in fact, at the campsite next to us, there were 5 vehicles, because they were having a reunion party at the campsite. How 5 vehicles ever got in and were able to park around that campsite, I have no idea. But they had 5 vehicles there, 3 tents, 1 trailer on 1 campsite. The place looked like a tenement facility rather than a campground because of all the extra cars and activities. Now, I'm not against having friends and family over as guests, but not to stay overnight and not to violate the campground rules of the number of people that are permitted at your campsite, and just as importantly, the number of vehicles. The other factor is that the authorities, when they escorted this gentleman off of the property, needed to make sure he wasn't going to come back. He was red hot and intoxicated. And if you had to lay your money down, I think you would say there was a pretty good chance that this guy was going to try to get back into the campground. And sure enough, about 2.5 hours later, after the sun had set, it was dark, he was back, and this all started up again. Fortunately, the second time around, they did arrest him. So there was 3 sheriff's cars there, came around to all the campsites in the area and said, don't worry, we've arrested him. You won't have this problem again. But by then, we'd have been exposed to 2 different brawls. And sadly, the children at this campsite were exposed to this. Our grandchildren were exposed to it. It was really a bummer, to say the least. I don't know what your thoughts are about this, but my thoughts are this. Number one, if the campground has rules about the number of vehicles at the site, they need to follow those rules. Number two, if there's quiet hours, they need to make sure that these are adhered to. Number three, just having physical presence of authorities, either on golf carts or driving around in a truck that's so marked as a part of the campground authorities, that helps to deter some of that behavior. It doesn't always eliminate it, but it sure helps to deter it. Lastly, the authorities knew that this guy was intoxicated. Don't let him off the hook. He started the brawl. Instead of being escorted off the property, he should have been taken down to the local jail and allowed to sober up overnight. Having him get a ride home so that he could think about how mad he was and then take a taxi back 2.5 to 3 hours later and start another brawl was really not prudent on the part of the authorities. So in this case, I know they were trying to cut the guy some slack, but in doing so, they set up the perfect storm so that he could come back. Thankfully, it didn't appear that anybody was seriously hurt, but in terms of what all the kids in the campground were exposed to, it was really very, very sad. I'd like to have your thoughts on this topic. You've probably seen some similar things when you've been camping, and I think it's really up to us as good citizens, as good campers, as those that like to watch out for our fellow campers, to really raise our hand and say to the authorities, enough is enough. Please enforce your rules, and when you've got a bad actor, make sure that if he's escorted off the campgrounds, he does not come back. Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you. I'm sure it's going to stimulate some interesting comments. If it has been helpful, please check that subscription box. But most importantly, as we say at the end of all of our videos, please continue to be safe and stay well. Thanks for watching.